Her cruel uncle sold her at 16 for a bag of nails to a silent ironworker. The hammer is still on the shelf above my cot. I don't use it anymore, fingers ain't what they were, and I got 2 boys who do the heavier work now, but I keep it there. Crossbeam, 2-pound head, hickory handle worn down to the color of river sand on the grip side. I was holding it the morning she came. I remember because I set it down on the anvil block, and then I couldn't think what I'd been doing with it. Stood there like a man who'd forgot his own name. I ain't going to tell this pretty. Never learned how to do that. I'm going to tell it like it happened, which means some of it will come out sideways and some of it I'll have to back up and come at again. That's the only way I know. My name is Harlan Cade. I was 31 years old that spring. I had been working iron since I was 9, first at my Uncle Dobbs' forge in eastern Missouri, then out on the rail crews as a spike driver, and later as the man who fixed what the spike drivers bent, broke, or couldn't handle. I had been moving west with the rail line for 6 years by then, camp to camp, and when the push finally slowed enough for a man to put down something like roots, I filed on 40 acres outside a town called Redstone, in the territory, dug a well, threw up a small forge shed with a proper brick firebox and a 12-foot bellows rail, and told myself that was enough. The forge was what I knew. I could work iron all day and into dark and not feel the time passing. Everything else, talking to people, being among them, the whole social machinery of a frontier town, that came hard to me, always had. I wasn't unfriendly, I don't think. I just didn't have much to say that wasn't about the work in front of me. Men came to me for ironwork and got what they paid for, and that was the whole transaction near as I could keep it. I had been married once, 6 years before Redstone. Her name was Carla, and she died of fever in a rail camp outside Cheyenne in the second winter we were together. I will say that plainly, and I won't say more about it, except that after Carla I closed something down that I didn't intend to open again. So that was me, 31, alone, good with iron, poor with everything else, the forge my whole life. Now I'll tell you about Jonas Pell, because you can't understand what happened without knowing about Pell. He came through Redstone with a wagon and a girl in March of that year, 1879, the ground still iron hard and the sky the color of a dirty tin cup. Pell was maybe 55, lean and sour-looking, the kind of man who seems to be settling a grievance with the world just by existing in it. He had a niece. That was how he introduced her, as his niece, like the word was a fact he was reading off a bill of goods. Her name was Nora. She was 16 years old. I know her age now because she told me later. That morning, I didn't know anything except that she climbed down from the wagon seat while her uncle went into the trading post, and she stood in the mud of the street in a coat that was too light for the cold, and she looked at my forge, shed the way you look at a fire when you've been without one for too long. I was working. I had an iron rim to true up for Bud Alderson's wagon wheel, and I was at the coal fire, and I looked up when I heard the wagon creak and I saw her standing there. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at the light from the firebox coming through the open forge door, that orange light on the cold morning. I went back to work. Pell was inside the trading post for maybe 20 minutes. When he came out, he stood on the porch and called to her, not her name, just a sharp sound, like you'd call a dog, and she went to him. I put my attention back on the rim. What happened next I only pieced together afterward, from what Nora told me and from what Amos Creech at the trading post told me later that same week. Pell had come into Redstone owing Amos money from a prior visit. Not a lot, $11, but Pell was the kind of man who couldn't tolerate a debt sitting on him, not because it pricked his conscience, but because it made him feel smaller than he wanted to feel. He'd come to settle it, but he was also cash short. So he looked around the post for something to trade against the debt, and Amos, who was nobody's fool but who had a weakness for good fasteners, had a crate of square-cut nails he'd been waiting on. And Pell had nails. Good ones, he'd gotten them off a rail supply wagon, Amos suspected, in a manner that didn't bear looking at too close. So they traded the debt against the nails, and Pell had a little cash left, and then Amos told me this part with his eyes on the counter, not on me. Pell said he had one more thing to offer if Amos was interested, and he tilted his head toward the street, toward Nora. Amos said he told Pell to get out of his store. But Pell wasn't done with the idea. I was still at the forge, doing the last heat on Alderson's rim, when Pell came around the corner of the shed. He had a burlap sack in one hand, the nails, I later figured, the ones Amos had given him back or that he'd kept separate. He stood at the doorway of the forge and looked me over, and then he looked at the shed, and then he looked at the girl, who was standing back by the wagon. "You the ironworker?" he said. I am. Got a shop, got land, you married. I turned back to the fire. No. He set the burlap sack on the ground just inside the door. It landed with a heavy clank. Good nails, I could tell by the sound. I'll leave her with you, he said. She's my niece. She's healthy, she works hard, she don't complain. I can't keep feeding her, and I got nowhere particular to go that a girl fits. You take her, the nails are yours. I looked at him then. I put the rim down, and I looked at him the way you look at something you want to make sure you're seeing right. He wasn't embarrassed. He wasn't even uncomfortable. He was just a man conducting business. I said, she's a person. He shrugged. She's 16, she needs a roof. Then give her money to get herself a roof. I don't have money to spare. I picked up the hammer, that crossbeam hammer, 2 pounds, hickory handle, and I set it down on the anvil block, which was just something to do with my hands, so I didn't do something else with them. You got nails to spare, I said. That sack's worth $4 at least. Give her the nails, and I'll drive her to Alderson's in the morning. His wife takes in boarders. She'll be safe there till she can arrange herself. I already told you my terms. I looked past him to the girl. She was watching us. She'd heard all of it, I was certain. Her face was still, not blank, not afraid, just still. Like a person who has learned to be still while things are decided about them. Miss, I said, you can come inside the shed and get warm. There's a bench against the back wall. She looked at her uncle. He didn't say anything. She walked into the shed and sat down on the bench. Pell picked up his sack of nails, his sack, the one he'd brought, not any sack of mine, and he said, I'll be back in a week to see if you've changed your mind. And he walked back to his wagon and drove out of Redstone without looking back once. He never came back. For 2 days I didn't know what to do. I'm not a man who handles the unexpected well. I can take a problem in iron, a cracked axle, a busted hinge pin, a door that's been hung wrong for 30 years. I can take any of that and solve it without getting flustered. But this wasn't iron. This was a 16-year-old girl sitting on my bench eating the last of a pot of pinto beans I'd made 3 days before and watching me work, and I didn't know the first thing about what to do for her. Her name was Nora Pell, though she told me she'd been born Nora Ash. Pell was her mother's brother, not her father's. Her mother and father had both died of the same fever, 2 years apart, and she'd been with Pell since she was 12. She told me all this the first evening while I was at the fire and she was on the bench, not volunteering it but answering when I asked. Short, clean answers. She didn't dress things up. Were you afraid when he left? I asked her. No, she said. You weren't afraid to be left with a stranger. She looked at the fire for a moment. You told him he was a person. I mean, you told him I was a person. She paused. He never said that about me. I didn't know what to say to that. I went back to the iron I was working. The second night I drove her out to Alderson's and explained the situation to Bud's wife, me, who was a sensible woman and took the situation in stride. Me said Nora could stay there for a while and earn her keep helping with the house and the children. Nora thanked her. She thanked me too in the yard before she went inside, and there was something in the way she thanked me, direct, like a handshake, like she meant it to land and she wanted me to know it had, that I thought about on the drive back to the forge. I didn't see her for almost 2 weeks. The winter broke slow that year. We had another freeze in the first week of April, hard enough to kill the early growth some of the garden women had put in, and then a wet spell that turned every road in the territory to sucking mud. I was busy. There was always work when the season changed, iron things that had been neglected through winter, broken tools that farmers suddenly needed now that the ground was softening. I worked long days, and I didn't think much about the girl at Alderson's. Or I tried not to. The truth is she came into my head at odd times, the way she'd sat on that bench, the stillness of her, the things she'd said about me calling her a person. Carla had been a talkative woman, bright and quick, always moving, always with something to say. Nora was the opposite of that in almost every way. I want to be careful here not to say the wrong thing. I wasn't comparing them, or if I wasn't doing it on purpose. A man's mind goes where it goes. Alderson came to me in the 3rd week of April with an order for a set of cabinet hinges, and while I was taking the measurements she mentioned that Nora was a good worker, quiet and steady, better than most hired girls she'd had. She's been asking about work in town, me said. She wants to earn her own way. She's 16, I said. She's nearly 17 now, and she's got more sense than most women twice her age. Me looked at me with the flat, appraising look she gave everything. She's not fragile, Harlan. You don't need to worry about her like she'll break. I'm not worried about her, I said. I barely know her. Me made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. The cabinet hinges were for a man named Teague who was building out the back room of the feed store, and I delivered them in the second week of May. I passed the schoolhouse on the way back. Redstone had a one-room school that ran 3 days a week, and I saw Nora coming out the door with the teacher, a woman named Mrs. Hartwell. They were talking. Nora had a slate board under her arm. She was going to school. I hadn't known that. She saw me and raised one hand, a small wave, nothing elaborate, and I raised mine and I drove on. But I thought about that for the rest of the day. The uncle who'd traded her for a bag of nails, the girl sitting in my forge, answering questions in short, clean sentences. And now she was standing outside a schoolhouse with a slate board, talking to the teacher. She was arranging herself like I'd said she should, doing it on her own without help from anybody. I'm not sure what I felt about that. Pride seems too big a word. Something smaller than pride and something that had an edge to it I couldn't explain right away. She came to the forge in June with a pot of stew. I was at the firebox, just finishing up a job, when I heard footsteps on the packed dirt outside and looked up, and it was her. She was carrying a covered iron pot, one of me's. I recognized the bale handle, and she set it on the table I used for eating when I remembered to eat, and she said, "Me sent this. She made too much." I looked at the pot, I looked at her. She was taller than I'd remembered, or maybe just standing straighter. Her hair was down, tied back plain with a piece of cord. There was a smudge of something on her sleeve, flour or clay, I couldn't tell which. "Tell her I said thank you," I said. "I'll tell her." She didn't leave. She looked at the anvil and the tools on the wall rack, the tongs in their bracket, the hardy and swage holes in the anvil face. "What were you making?" "Clevis pin for Tillman's plow." "Can I watch?" I don't know why I said yes. I think it was because she didn't ask it the way most people did, as if they wanted to be entertained, as if the forge was a performance for their benefit. She asked it like she wanted to understand the thing, not just watch it happen. "Don't touch the anvil block," I said. "The corners hold heat." "I know," she said. "I burned my hand on one when I was 8. My father had a small forge, only for nails and mending, not for real work, but I remember the smell." She sat on the bench, the same bench as before, and I went back to the Clevis pin, and she watched. She didn't talk while I worked, which I appreciated. She watched the way a person watches when they're actually seeing something, not just passing the time. When I quenched the pin and the steam came up, she leaned forward slightly, just for a second, and then sat back again. I finished the pin and set it to cool and ate the stew, which was good, venison and dried beans, and something that might have been wild onion. She sat on the bench and didn't eat because she'd already eaten, she said. We talked a little, not much. She told me Mrs. Hartwell was teaching her arithmetic and she'd caught up faster than the teacher expected. I said I wasn't surprised. She asked why. I said because she listened carefully. She thought about that for a moment, as if she wasn't sure if it was a compliment or just an observation, and then she said, "You listen carefully, too." She picked up the pot and left. I sat there for a while after she was gone. The pot of stew was about 3/4 empty, which was more than I usually ate. The fire had burned down to coals. Outside, the last of the evening light was going off the plains, turning them from gold to the color of old brass. I picked up the crossbeam hammer and put it back on its hook on the wall, and thought about a girl who said I listened carefully. She came back the next week. Not with stew, just to watch, she said, if I didn't mind. I said I didn't mind. She sat on the bench and I worked and she watched. This went on for 4 or 5 visits before she started asking questions. They were good questions. Not why do you do that, but how do you know when the iron is the right color? How do you hold the tongs so you don't lose the piece in the quench? What does a high carbon piece sound like against the hammer versus a low carbon piece? I answered them. Gradually, I started talking while I worked instead of just working, explaining what I was doing and why. I hadn't done that since I was an apprentice myself, since old Dobb used to say that talking about the work makes you know the work better than working alone. I don't know when I started looking forward to her coming. In July, she told me she wanted to learn to work the bellows. I showed her how. She was strong enough to keep a steady rhythm, and she caught the breathing of it, how to feel when the fire was asking for more air and when it had enough in about 20 minutes. I told her that usually took new men a week to learn. She said maybe men didn't pay attention the same way. I said that was probably true. She said it matter of fact, not to needle me, and I laughed. First real laugh I'd had in a good while, I think. The sound of it surprised me slightly, like a voice in an empty room. August was hot the way August in the territory always was brutal, the kind of heat that turned the grass to paper and made the dogs lie in the shade and not move till sundown. I was working long days to fill orders before fall, when everything would shift to winterizing work. Nora was coming to the forge 3 and sometimes 4 times a week by then. Me Alderson had raised her pay slightly and given her Thursdays free, and Thursday was when she came most reliably. I want to be careful about what I say here, about what I was thinking that summer. I was 31, and she was not yet 17, and I wasn't fool enough to mistake what was happening in my own chest for something I had the right to act on, or even to name. So I didn't name it. I put my head down and worked and was glad when she came and was less glad when she went. And I didn't think about the future because thinking about the future had never done me much good. But I did things, small things. I fixed the broken leg on the bench so she'd have a more level sit. I put in a small window on the side of the forge shed where she usually sat, so there'd be a cross breeze on hot days. I told myself these were things I'd been meaning to do anyway, which was not entirely a lie. She noticed the window. She didn't say anything about it except to say it was a good spot for it, which it was. The trouble came in September. A man named Greer came to Redstone, Calhoun Greer, late 30s, good-looking in the way that is all surface, with a big gray horse and a coat that had been expensive once. He'd had a ranch down in the Colorado Territory that had failed, from what I gathered, and he was looking to start over somewhere new. He had enough money left to buy a small place outside of town and start a herd. He was the kind of man who talked to everybody and charmed most of them. He was in the trading post the same day I was in there buying meal and salt pork, and he introduced himself to me with a firm handshake and a good smile, and said he'd heard I was the ironworker and he'd need plenty of that kind of work as he got his place set up. I said, "Come by when you're ready." That was our first exchange. The second one was worse. He'd noticed Nora. Of course he had, most men did, though she was young enough that most of them kept whatever they noticed to themselves. But Greer was not the kind of man who kept things to himself. He started coming by the Alderson place to chat with me, which he dressed up as general friendliness, and he always contrived to be there when Nora was visible. Me told me this with a flat look on her face, the same look she'd given me when she said Nora was not fragile. "Does he make her uncomfortable?" I asked. "She doesn't show it if he does," Me said. "She's polite to him, but she's polite to everybody." "She's 16. 17. She turned 17 in August." I hadn't known that either. I thought about that on the way back to the forge. 17 in August, and nobody had made anything of it, not even me, it seemed, not a cake or a kept day. I felt something sour about that, something close to anger, though it wasn't directed at me, who was kind to her in the practical ways, not the celebrating ways. When Nora came on Thursday, I was halfway through a set of stall hooks for the livery, and she sat on the bench, and I kept working. After a while I said, "I hear you had a birthday in August." She looked up. "Me told you." "Is that a problem?" She considered it. "No." "I didn't know," I said. "I would've." And then I stopped, because I didn't know exactly what I would have done, and saying I would have done something without knowing what was a kind of promise I didn't have the right to make. "It's all right," she said. "I don't make much of birthdays. I never did." I set down the hook I was working and looked at her directly, which I didn't often do. She looked back at me the same way she always did, steady, without the lowered eyes or the flicker away that most people did when they were held at. "You should," I said. "Make something of it." She held my look for a moment, and then she looked at the iron on the anvil, not breaking away, just moving her attention. "I like it here," she said. "Coming here, that's something I make something of." I went back to the stall hooks. In October, Greer made his move. He showed up at the Alderson place on a Sunday when Bud and me were at church and the older children were with them, and Nora was there alone minding the 2 youngest. He sat on the porch and he talked, and he was charming and smooth, and he told her he'd seen a lot of the world and she deserved to see it too, and he said he was going to be somebody in this valley, and he wanted a woman beside him who was, he said this, apparently worth looking at. She told me this the following Thursday. She told it plain, no drama in it, just the facts of what happened. "What did you say to him?" I asked. "I said I had to get back to the children." And he said he'd be back. She was quiet for a moment. He looked at me like I was something he'd already decided to buy. Something went tight in my chest. I held the tong I was holding and I didn't move for a moment, and then I said, calm as I could, "Has he tried to put his hands on you?" "No. If he does, I know how to use a cast iron skillet," she said, which was so matter-of-fact and so exactly right that I almost smiled. But I didn't. "Tell me," I said. "I did. Me says he's harmless." "Me is wrong. I went to see Greer. I don't tell this part to sound like something I'm not. I'm not a violent man. I've been in fights. You can't spend 6 years in rail camps and not have been. But I don't look for them, and I don't like them, and I don't think there's anything admirable in a man who does. But I understood one thing about men like Greer, from 22 years of working alongside every kind of man there was. They didn't back down from argument, and they didn't back down from charm, and they didn't back down from the law when the law was distant. The only thing they backed down from was something they were afraid of. I went to his new place in the morning. He was in the yard when I rode up talking to one of his hired men. He saw me and he smiled that big surface smile and he said, "Cade, come to look at the place. I got plans for this valley." I got down from the horse and I walked over to him and I stopped at a distance that was inside the comfortable distance, close enough that he couldn't ignore the size of me or what my hands looked like after 22 years of forge work. And I said, "Nora Ash, you'll leave her alone." The smile didn't go away, but something changed under it. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do. She's 17. She works for good people. You'll leave her alone." "She's not your—" "Leave her alone," I said again. Not loud, not angry sounding, just the way you say a thing you mean. He studied me for a moment. The hired man had found something to do over by the fence. Greer smiled again, but it was different now, tighter, defensive. "I'm not looking for trouble," he said. "Good," I said. I got back on my horse and rode home. Greer was polite to Nora at a distance for the rest of the fall, and then he found a widow woman in Fentress County to interest him, and he rode over there in November, and that was the end of it. I didn't tell Nora I'd gone to see him. She found out from me, who found out from Bud, who heard it from somebody who knew Greer's hired man. She didn't say anything about it for a while. November came down cold and clear, the first real cold of the season, and the work shifted the way it always did: storm shutters, hinge replacements, chains and cleats for the livestock that would be kept up through winter. I was at the forge 12 hours some days, and I didn't mind. The cold made the fire feel better, the heat of the firebox more righteous somehow, the iron moving cleaner under the hammer. Nora came on Thursdays and some Saturdays by then. She'd learned to hold and turn the piece without being told, anticipating where I needed it, not because I'd taught her that, but because she'd watched closely enough that she knew. We worked together without much talking on those days, which suited me, and I think suited her too. One Saturday in early November she came in and she said, without any preamble, "Mrs. Hartwell is leaving in the spring. She's going back east to be with her sister." "I heard that," I said. "She asked me if I wanted to take the assistant position through the winter, help her through the end of the school year. It pays a little. Will you take it?" "I think so." She sat down on the bench. She was wearing a gray wool coat, a proper one, not the light coat from March, and her hands were red from the cold. She also said I might be able to teach on my own in the fall if I wanted. She'd speak to the school board. I looked at her. "You'd be good at that." "You think so?" "You explain things well. You see what a person understands and what they don't. That's most of what teaching is." She folded her hands in her lap and looked at the fire in the firebox, that same look she'd had the first morning she came, the look of someone who has been cold for a long time. "I didn't think I'd be good at much," she said, "when I came here in March. I didn't think I was good at much." "Why not?" "Because nobody said I was." I turned back to the iron I was working. I took 3 or 4 hammer passes on a set of wagon bolts, the ring of the metal filling up the shed the way it always did, and then I said, "You're good at a lot of things, Nora." She didn't say anything. I thought maybe I'd embarrassed her, or maybe it just hadn't landed the way I'd meant it. But after a while she said, quiet, "You don't say things you don't mean." "No," I said, "I don't." "Then I'll take it as true." We worked the rest of that morning without talking much, And when she left at noon, she looked back once from the doorway, and I was watching her go, and she knew it, and she nodded once, and then she was gone. December was the hardest month in those parts. Not the coldest, January could be worse, but the hardest, because December was when the reality of winter settled in and the distances between places felt longest and the dark came early and stayed. A man alone with a forge and 40 acres felt it more than most. I worked. I had a long order from the Redstone Mercantile, 6 dozen rivets for a stock of harness work they were getting repaired, and a set of fireplace cranes for a house being built at the south end of town. And I worked through the order methodically, and I didn't think about being alone because I never used to, and I wasn't about to start now. But I was thinking about something else. I want to tell this straight so I don't make myself out to be either a fool or a saint, because I was neither. I was thinking about the spring, about what happened in the spring when school ended and when a woman with some education and some earnings and her own sense could make her own arrangements. She'd be close to 18 by then. She could go wherever she wanted. She could go east to teach. She could go to one of the bigger territorial towns where they needed teachers badly. She could go anywhere. She had no reason particular to stay in Redstone. I spent about 3 weeks in December being approximately as useless to myself as I'd ever been in my life, which is saying something. I was short with Bud Alderson when he brought a cracked single bar in to be mended, which wasn't like me, and I overworked a batch of rivet blanks and had to scrap them, which hadn't happened since I was a boy. My attention was in the wrong place. One evening in the 3rd week of December, I was sitting at the fire in the forge, just sitting, not working, which was unusual, and I was looking at that crossbeam hammer on its hook on the wall. I'd had it since my first year on the rail line. Bought it off a toolmaker in Kansas City for 75 cents, which was half a day's wages at the time. It had been the first good tool I owned that was truly mine, not borrowed or inherited or found. I'd worked probably 80,000 hours with that hammer, maybe more. And I thought about that morning in March when I'd set it down on the anvil block because a girl was standing in the street looking at my fire, and I hadn't known what to do with my hands. I stood up and I took the hammer off the hook and I held it, just held it, the familiar weight of it, the worn hickory in my palm, and I thought, you are 31 years old, and you are the best ironworker between Redstone and the rail junction at Brixton. And you fixed the bench and put in the window, and you rode to Greer's place, and none of that was nothing. All of that meant something. And if you are going to spend the rest of your life talking yourself out of things, then you are going to be an old man very fast. I put the hammer back on the hook and went to bed. Christmas that year fell on a Thursday. Me Alderson had a dinner for any hand or hired help who had nowhere else to be, and she included me, which she did most years, because she knew I was alone and because she and Bud were decent people that way. I came at noon with a smoked ham I'd been keeping and a set of candlestick irons I'd made for me, which she'd been wanting for 2 years and I'd kept forgetting to finish. Nora was there. She was helping me in the kitchen when I came in, and she came to the doorway when she heard me, and she had flour on her hands and a look on her face that I didn't know how to read at first, not quite a smile, something beneath a smile, something that was glad to see me specifically, not just glad to see another person come through the door. That's a thing you can feel if you're paying attention. The difference between a face that's glad for company and a face that's glad it's you. I'd had enough of the first kind in my life to know the second kind when I saw it. We ate. There were 7 of us at the table, me and Nora and me and Bud and the 4 children, and we ate well and there was talk around the table. The children loud and the adults quieter. And at some point in the afternoon, Bud fell asleep in his chair, and the children went outside despite the cold, and me was washing up, and Nora and I were sitting on opposite sides of the table with the wreckage of the meal between us. I said, "Are you going to take the teaching post in the fall?" She looked at me. "I've been thinking about it." "What's the thinking?" "Whether it's," she stopped and started again, "whether Redstone is where I want to stay." I kept my eyes on the table. There was a grease stain on the oilcloth from where one of the children had knocked a bowl. I looked at that. And she didn't answer right away. Outside, I could hear the children shouting at each other about something, and me was moving around in the kitchen, and the fire was burning in the fireplace, and the silence at the table was specific and full in a way that silences either are or aren't. She said, "When you went to see Greer, you didn't tell me, you just went." "I told you." "I know, I found out." She paused. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I thought about it." "Because it was something that needed doing and I did it. I didn't need credit for it. She was quiet for a moment. You do things like that. You notice things that need doing and you do them without making it a production. The bench, the window, you thought I didn't notice, but I noticed. I looked up at her then. She was looking at me the way she looked at iron in the fire, with full attention, seeing it clear. No performance in her face, no prettying it up. I notice you, she said. I've been noticing you since March. I don't have a smooth way to tell the rest of that. I'm not a man who does things smoothly in that department. I said something and she said something, and I am not going to put words to all of it because some of it is mine and hers and nobody else's business. But I will tell you that at some point in the afternoon, me came back into the room, took one look at us, and went quietly back into the kitchen, which she would later deny doing, but she absolutely did. And I will tell you that later, when the children came back inside and the light was going and it was time to go, Nora walked me out to where my horse was tied, and she stood in the cold with the last of the December sun coming flat and orange across the plains, and she looked up at me and she put her hand flat on my chest, above the heart, just for a moment, feeling the solidity of it like you check a piece of iron to see if it's cooled. Then she took her hand back. I'll be at the forge Thursday, she said. I'll be there, I said. So, that's the part people want to know, I suppose. The rest is a man's life, which doesn't come in scenes the same way. We were married in April of 1880, when she was 17 and I was 32, at the Redstone Church, which was a small building with a dirt floor that they kept promising to put boards on and never did. Me Alderson cried, which surprised me. Bud Alderson shook my hand for a long time and didn't say much, which didn't surprise me at all. I want to tell you about the year or two after, because I think it's important to tell it right. There are men who'll tell you that taking a young wife is a kind of ownership, or that a girl who was traded for nails must be grateful, and they'd be wrong in a way that I can't quite explain except to say, try it. Try having Nora Ash across the table from you every morning for 50 years and see if ownership is the word that comes to mind. She had opinions. She had them from the start, and she never stopped having them. She argued with me when she thought I was wrong, which was less often than she would probably tell you, but more often than I'm going to admit. She took the teaching post in the fall of 1880, and she kept it for 12 years, until the boys were old enough to need her different attention, and she was as good at it as I'd said she would be, better, probably. 3 of her students went on to university. She is still the thing I'm proudest of having been right about. The boys, we had 2 Dobb named for my uncle and a second one named Thomas who we called Tom. They work the forge now more or less, though I still go in when I've got something particular to do or something I want to show them. Dobb has my hands wide, thick-fingered, good for the hammer, and Tom has Nora's eyes, level and clear. Both of them can hold a steady temperature on a fire, and neither of them overworks a hot piece, which is most of what I wanted to teach them. The forge is still there. The bellows rail is new. I replaced it in 1891. The old one had finally given up, but the brick firebox is the original. And the anvil is the same one I've had since my second year in Redstone, a 200-pound English pattern that I dragged across 40 miles of territorial road behind a borrowed mule. The bench where Nora used to sit is still against the back wall. Nobody sits on it now except me sometimes, when I'm done for the day and I want to sit a while. She came to the forge just last week, which she still does most Thursdays, same as she always has, not to help with the work mostly, just because we're comfortable in the same space and always have been. She sat on the bench and I was at the firebox doing a small repair on a stovepipe bracket, and the fire was going and the shed was warm against the cold outside, and after a while she said, "You're slow." "I'm 62, I said. "So am I, and I'm not slow." "You never worked iron." "I worked bellows for 8 years. I worked plenty." She was right, so I didn't argue it. I finished the bracket and I set it to cool, and I went and sat beside her on the bench, room for both of us, now that the boys have gone and nobody else needs it, and she put her head against my shoulder the way she does. Not a dramatic thing, just the way she settles, like something coming to rest where it belongs. Outside the snow was coming down easy, not hard, the first snow of the season. The plains beyond the forge door were going white and quiet. I looked at that crossbeam hammer on the shelf above the cot. Still there. Still the same weight it always was, still the same worn place on the hickory where my palm goes. The thing about iron is it tells you the truth. You can't lie to it, not with the fire, not with the hammer, not about the quality of what you're doing. It will tell you straight. You know within the first heat whether the piece is going to hold or crack, and you know by the sound of the hammer whether you're working it right or fighting it. I think that's why she and I understood each other from the start. She's telling me something now, and I'm listening. Outside the snow is coming down and the fire is low, and the plains are quiet in the way they get when a season changes. The hammer is on the shelf. The bench holds the both of us. That's all it ever needed to do.